Eighth grade. I was just about to watch Armageddon on Netflix, but then my subscription expired. Oh well, at least it's not the end of the world. I was wondering, there's a show on Netflix called The Crown. It's about Queen Elizabeth II. And I was wondering, like, what does she get out of that? Why would the Queen want a Netflix docu-series, or drama series rather, about her childhood and her family? And then I realized, oh, she probably gets the royalties. Oh man. Uh, I heard about this Netflix sci-fi show that everyone's watching, and I kept hearing from everyone that it was a really weird show. But to be honest, I've seen Stranger Things. I couldn't resist another Stranger Things Netflix joke. All right. We are now doing the questions from the Chapter 7 study guide. So let's get through this quickly, if we can. Number 1. How did westward expansion heighten the intensity of the slavery debate in the United States? What was the Missouri Compromise and how did it attempt to resolve this issue? Okay, so the problem you have is that westward expansion means that there's going to be new states added to the Union. Right. So before the addition of Missouri to the United States, there were 22 states. There were 11 in the north, and there were 11 in the south. All of the southern states had slavery. All of the northern states outlawed slavery. Right? So there's this like delicate balance in the United States between north and south, slave and free. Well, with westward expansion, you have a lot of people moving into the Louisiana Territory, and there's a big question as to when those territories become states, are they going to be states where slavery is legal or illegal? And that really matters because, as you know from our study of the Constitution, every state has representatives in Congress, in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. And if you're from a slave state, you are going to want Congress to pass laws to protect slavery in the southern states. And if you're a free state, there's a good chance that your constituents, the people that voted for you, are going to want you to work to pass laws to make slavery illegal in the entire country. Right? So the slavery debate is really heating up. And people realize that if Missouri is added to the Union, Missouri is going to be added as a slave state. So now you'll have 12 slave states and 11 free states. So this is going to tip the balance in Congress in favor of the slave states. Right? So a lot of people resisted the idea of allowing Missouri to enter the Union. And Southerners were really upset about this because Southerners wanted another slave state to be represented in Congress. So the Missouri Compromise was proposed by Henry Clay in order to solve this problem. So the Missouri Compromise was a deal struck in Congress in which Missouri would be added as a slave state, but at the same time, Maine would be added as a free state. So now instead of having 11 slave states and 11 free states, you now have 12 slave states and 12 free states. So this would keep the balance in Congress. And then the Missouri Compromise also said, in the future, states that are south of the Missouri border, that are part of the Louisiana Territory, those are going to be slave states. And states north of the southern Missouri border that are part of the Louisiana Territory, they are going to be free states. Right? So that's what the Missouri Compromise was. It tried to resolve the issue by keeping the balance between slave states and free states in Congress. Right? They wanted it to be equal. Okay, number 2, how did the construction of factories lead to urbanization? This one's really simple. Factories were mostly built in cities. Not all factories were. Remember, in the beginning, factories were built wherever there was a river, for example. But as the country progressed, factories were built pretty much exclusively in cities. And so all of these people who previously worked in farms in rural areas wanted the opportunity to make wages by working in factories. And so they moved themselves, and if they had families, they moved their families from rural areas to cities where these factories were. And because thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of people were doing this, all within just a couple of years, the cities became very crowded. Right? And this movement of people from rural areas to cities is what is called urbanization. Right? The cities kind of ballooned. Right? They became very densely populated. It's because factories were built there and people wanted to work in the factories. All right, number 3, why were Southerners dependent on slavery while Northerners were not? So this is a complicated question, but I'm going to give you a simple answer. Southerners were dependent on slavery because Southerners were agrarian, right? They made money by planting crops, things like tobacco and cotton and other things like sugar that grow in the South, right? So their economy was based on agriculture, and in order to work the fields and make a lot of money by producing these things, they needed slave labor, right? By contrast, the North did not have an agrarian economy. They had a factory-based economy, right? So, and as you know, slaves didn't work in the factories. The factories were places for people like immigrants to work or poor people to work, not slaves. So there wasn't much need for slaves in the North. There was a great need for slaves in the South. Now, why is it that the North is where all the factories are and the South is where all the plantations are and all the big farms are? Well, this is mostly because of geography, right? The North has a lot of rivers and lakes and resources that you can use to run factories. The North is also where you have all the capitalists. They all live in the Northeast. So the capitalists are going to be less likely to invest in a factory that's like 1,000 miles to the south of them, right? If you're a capitalist in Boston, you're not going to invest in building a factory in Louisiana, right? It's really far away from you. You want to be close to where your money is invested, right? So factories get built in the North because the North is where the capitalists are. The North is where the rivers and the lakes are. The North is also where the cities like Boston and New York are. And as we know, Boston and New York are places that have access to ports, merchants, businesses. There's a lot of trade that goes on there. So there's just really big differences between the North and the South. One is more hospitable to business, and the South, as you know, is warmer. It has fewer problems with freezing during the winters, right? So you're not going to have a lot of farms built in the North either. You're not going to build a tobacco plantation in Philadelphia. That's just not going to happen, right? But you will build a lumber mill there. Okay. How did Americans benefit from the Industrial Revolution? So they benefited because the Industrial Revolution made more products available for lower prices. So it dramatically increased supply and dramatically reduced the price. Usually when supply goes up, the price goes down. So the more textile mills there are, that means the more women's dresses there are, right? And the more women's dresses there are, the less expensive they get. Okay? All right. Um, oh, and then also, of course, the Industrial Revolution made the country as a whole much wealthier. Number 5, what kinds of arguments did Southern slave supporters give to justify their support for slavery? So you can look at the video and the slides that contain the pro-slavery arguments. I'll just go over it real quickly here. Southerners basically said, we need slavery because our economy is dependent on us being able to own and use slaves. Without slaves, our economy is going to collapse. Also, they would say slavery is not that bad. At least it's not that bad compared to the terrible factory conditions in the North, where you have like children working in factories and losing their fingers in these machines and things like that. Right? So they basically tried to downplay the evils of slavery and also say, we really need slavery, otherwise our economy is going to collapse. Okay. Number 6, why were steam-powered factory machines superior to water-powered factory machines? So the introduction of steam-powered machines into factories was a really big deal. Why is this? Because it meant that factories did not have to be built alongside rivers, right? Remember, water-powered machines required running water to operate these machines. So you would have to build a factory alongside a running river. And then in the winter, when that river froze, you had to shut your factory down because there was nothing to power it. Steam-powered machines means that you can build your factory anywhere you want. You just have to transport water into it to operate the machines. And secondly, you can run your factory during the winter. Okay, number 7, how are freed African Americans treated in the North? How did this compare to the treatment of European immigrants and whites who worked in northern factories? So the answer is obviously they were treated better than slaves were in the South, but freed African Americans were not treated well in the North initially. There were still a lot of laws that states had that forbade African Americans from voting, from running for office, from serving on juries, things like that. There was also a lot of prejudice and racial discrimination against them. So people who managed factories, when they were looking to hire laborers, they would hire African Americans last, right? They would much rather hire white immigrants. I mean, the people they wanted to hire the most were like poor white farmers from the rural areas who were Americans, right? And then if there weren't enough of them applying for the job, then they would shift over to hiring like an immigrant from Europe. And then if there weren't enough of them to hire, maybe they would hire the African American person, maybe. Right? So African Americans were not treated well in the North. They were treated worse than European immigrants and American native-born white Americans. Okay. Why were capitalists willing to take the risk of investing in business and infrastructure? Things like, why were they willing to invest in building mills and factories, roads, canals, railroads, things like that? Because they thought they'd make a lot of money by doing this, right? It's high risk, high reward. You invest $100,000 in building a canal, right? But the idea is when the canal is dug, everyone who uses the canal is going to have to pay a fee, and part of that fee goes to you because you are a capitalist who invested your money in this building project. And so you have the right to charge people to use it. So they were willing to risk large amounts of money to do this because they thought they'd make money by doing it. All right, so that's answer number 1. Answer number 2 is because a lot of factories and mills in the North did not have easy ways to transport goods and materials, right? And so by building roads and canals and railroads and things like that, they would help their factories to receive materials quicker and ship out their products a lot quicker, right? So it's an investment in basically making their factories more productive. Okay. Why might an Irish or Italian immigrant be treated differently than a German immigrant? So usually they would be treated worse than the German immigrant. Why is this? Well, remember, Americans at this time, many of them are nativists. Nativists want people in the United States to be three things. Native born. Obviously, immigrants are not native born. All right, so Germans, Irish, Italian immigrants, they don't check that box. They're not native born. But maybe they check one of the other two boxes. Right? Nativists also want Americans to be white and Protestant, right? Well, Irish, German, Italian, they're white, okay? Almost put down the wrong finger. But what about Protestant? Right? Well, Italians and Irish people are Catholic for the most part. So they don't check that box. The only box they check is that they're white. Germans, on the other hand, are Protestants. Right? So Germans are going to be treated better because they check two of the three boxes. Italians and Irish are going to be treated worse because they only check one of the three boxes. Another reason Germans are going to be treated better than the Irish and Italians is because the Irish are mostly poor people who are fleeing the Irish potato famine. Italians are moving to the United States for other reasons, but Italian immigrants are mostly poor as well. German immigrants, many of them are actually wealthy. They're moving to the United States because they're fleeing political persecution, right? They're German revolutionaries. Many of them are educated. Many of them have money. And so the United States is going to be more likely to accept people who have money and who are wealthy, right? Because they're going to be able to land and immediately open a business and hire people. They're going to pay taxes. They're going to help make their state, their country wealthier. So the United States had an incentive to welcome wealthy German immigrants. And they knew the Irish were probably going to be poor, and same with the Italians. All right. Oh, jeez. A student, if you hear that beeping, that's because a student who shall remain nameless, who has not turned in any work at all, basically, decided that now would be a really good time to turn in all the missing work. So there's like 40 assignments that are getting turned in. By the way, I'm not going to grade it because the grades from the progress reports are set. All right. Let's see. Number 10. How might the life of a Lowell girl be different than the life of a child laborer in a typical factory? So Lowell girls were workers who would work in places called Lowell mills. Lowell mills were an early form of factory or mill. They were not built in cities. They were usually built in more rural areas. And the idea of working at a Lowell mill is that in addition to earning wages, you also receive an education. And you live in a small community of people, of young people like you, right? Young women like you who want to support themselves financially and also receive an education, right? So the life of a Lowell girl was probably a lot better than the life of a child laborer in a typical factory. A child laborer in a typical factory is going to be paid very, very little money, and they're not going to receive an education. They are there because they're extremely poor and their parents are making them do this, right? So a child laborer is basically working at the mercy of the factory. A Lowell girl is there because she wants to be there and she wants to better herself. All right. 11. Why did many slaves not know who their parents were? This is because under the slave codes, slave parents did not have a right to raise their own children. If the owner wanted to separate the parents from their children, then the owner could sell the children to a different slave owner, and there was nothing the parents could do about it. So many slaves didn't know who their parents were because they were sold as children. Okay, number 12. So number 12 is a kind of creative question. And I used names from last year's 8th grade class, Mieko and Rachel, because I used this study guide with last year's 8th grade class as well. So a question like this doesn't have a set right or wrong answer. This is kind of an open question. So your informed opinion is welcome. Right? A question like this is a hypothetical, so you have to kind of think through it a little bit before you write your answer. Imagine Mieko's lumber mill needs to ship wood to Rachel's furniture factory. The mill is built next to a lake, while the factory sits on a riverbank. A riverbank is the side of a river. If the mill and the factory are in the south, why might a canal be the best way to transport the lumber? If the mill and the factory are in the north, why might Mieko and Rachel decide that the railroad is the best way to transport the lumber? And then finally, in what circumstances might it be best to transport the lumber with a roadway? Okay, so there's a lot to take in there. Let's take it one question at a time. We'll start with, if the mill and the factory are in the south, why might a canal be the best way to transport lumber? So you have to think, okay, we have a lumber mill and a factory. The mill needs to ship the wood to the factory. They're both in the south. The mill is built alongside a lake. The factory is built alongside a river. Why would a canal be the best way to transport those goods? Seems pretty straightforward. The answer I came up with here is the obvious one. If you came up with something else that makes sense, great. There's no single right or wrong answer. But the answer I have is, well, you have two bodies of water. All you have to do is dig a canal between the mill and the factory. Water is going to flow in between the river and the lake, and you have a man-made flowing water highway, basically. Right? You put the wood on a raft or a steamboat, and you ship it off. It seems pretty simple. So it might be the best way to transport the lumber because, the South has good weather for canals. This person is still turning in work. So the canal's not going to freeze during the winter, for example. The South also might be a difficult place to build a railroad, right? A railroad needs pretty sturdy land to be constructed. And what does the South have a lot of? It has a lot of swamps and marshes, right? You can't really build a railroad through a swamp or a marsh. So maybe a canal is the best thing to do because they're in a wetlands area in the South. Okay, if the mill and factory are in the north, why might Mieko and Rachel decide that a railroad is the best way to transport the lumber? Well, so the north, we kind of have the opposite problem, right? The north, you can dig a canal, and canals in the north, like the Erie Canal, are very successful. The problem is, in the north, it gets really, really cold in the winter, and the canal could freeze, or the lake could freeze, or the river could freeze, right? And if one of those things freezes, then the canal is not going to be useful, right? So instead, you might want to use a railroad, right? Now, the great thing about a railroad is the railroad can't freeze. The rails can run through you can run trains through rails all year long, right? Also, a railroad is something that requires a capitalist to construct it, right? So you need capitalists investing in order to build a railroad if there's not already a railroad there. And most capitalists we know are in the north. They're not going to be in the south. So it might be easier to have a railroad constructed. Or more likely, there are already railroads in the north because there's already a lot of factories and businesses in the north. So the chances that you're going to be able to use a railroad are a lot higher than in the south. In what circumstances might it be best to transport the lumber with a roadway? All right, so this one's kind of interesting because it doesn't say if these factories are in the north or the south, right? So the answer I came up with here is, well, roads are really expensive to build, but if there already is a road between the two, between the factory and the mill, then it makes sense just to put the lumber on wagons and ship them on the pre-existing road, right? And if there isn't a road, you could maybe get a capitalist to invest in building the road, especially if the factory and the mill are close together, right? If they're only like a mile apart, building a road between the two is not going to be a huge deal. So if they're close together, then maybe using a road is the best thing to do. Right, so it's questions like this. They require you to kind of be creative, to kind of think outside of the box, use the information you have, and don't feel limited by the information you have. Right? I didn't set up any rules in this scenario. I just gave you information and asked a bunch of open questions. Right? So if you see a question like this, don't be intimidated by it. All right, that's it for the study guide questions. The next video, I'm going to talk about the previous test and what you need to know for this upcoming quiz.